In this video, we're going to take a look at exposure as somewhat of a balancing act between our choices and the way the camera responds to try to create the best exposure. But first, let's take a brief look at stops again. In shutter speed, it's measured in time, and you can see the arrow up there pointing to 1/15th of a second. Now we're going to represent that by this box around an image sensor. So if we move from 1/15th of a second to 1/30th of a second, we're cutting the amount of time that light is allowed to pass through to the sensor in half. And so we're just representing that by this box showing that it is reducing the amount of time that light is allowed to reach the sensor in half every time we change to one of the stops. With Aperture, we have the same kind of situation, only there we're dealing with the area of light that's allowed to pass through the sensor. It's not a time value, it's an area of light value. So if we have a 2.8 lens and we go to f4, we're not cutting the diameter in half, we're cutting the total area in half. And as we switch to f5.6 and f8 and f11 and so on, you can see that we're cutting the amount of area that the iris is open in half. And those are the aperture stops. Let's take a look at the effect that shutter has on exposure when we move from one shutter speed to another. And let's just say, for example, that we have this image, very bright image. The shutter was open for 1/15th of a second, which is a long exposure, and our aperture was at f8. And without the camera adjusting the aperture every time we change a shutter speed, let's just look at the effect on the image going from 1/15th of a second to 1/30th of a second. We cut the amount of light in half. Well, essentially, we're cutting the amount of time that the shutter stays open in half. The effect is that half of the amount of light is making contact with the sensor, and the image is a little bit darker. If we go to 1/60th of a second, half of the amount of light again, and so the exposure is darker again. And as we keep going to faster and faster shutter speeds, we're letting light contact the sensor for less and less amount of time, and the image continues to look darker until the point when we're at 1/1000th of a second and it's grossly underexposed. Same thing on the aperture side. If, for example, we start out at f2.8, the camera's not going to change the shutter speed at all. Let's just pretend that it's not going to change that. Maybe we're in manual mode, and we're just going to look at the effect of changing the aperture size. So we're at our maximum aperture right now, and it's a very bright overexposed image. If we go to f4, we're cutting the area of the iris opening. We're cutting that area in half, which has the effect of letting half of the amount of light in. And you can see the image got a little bit darker. If we go to f5.6, we're cutting again in half the amount of light reaching the sensor. And as we keep moving one stop at a time, the aperture is getting smaller. The amount of area inside that iris opening is getting smaller. So the effect is that half and half and half of the amount of light keeps reaching the sensor until the part where at f22. In this case, we have a grossly underexposed image. Well, it's not the way the camera usually works when we change, when we're in shutter priority or in aperture priority. The camera tries to balance the exposure by making a corresponding one-stop change every time we change a stop. So let's say, for example, that it's at 1/125th of a second, and we are in shutter priority and we want to take an action shot. We know that we need to get to 1/500th of a second, which is 2 full stops away. And so we make that change from 1/25th to 1/500th of a second. Well, the camera needs to balance that by opening the aperture 2 stops to let twice as much light come through that surface area, because we cut in half and half again the amount of time that we were letting light contact the sensor. So we were decreasing the amount of time that light was allowed to reach the sensor, and that camera had to correspond by making twice as big and twice as big again the lens opening or the aperture opening to allow that amount of light come in. We can also control the aperture side by being in aperture priority mode, and if we were starting out at our original f8 and 1/125th of a second, as we take a landscape shot and want a great depth of field, we're going to our smallest aperture opening, which is 3 stops from the original position, and the camera had to balance that by going 3 stops in the opposite direction on the shutter speed side. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Hopefully things will come together. So let's say we're in shutter priority, and we're starting out at 1/125th of a second, and the camera has selected that at 1/125th of a second, a perfect exposure is the aperture at f8, pretty much right in the middle of the aperture opening. Down here on the bottom, we are representing again time by this box around the sensor, and here we have an image of our aperture at an f8 and at 1/25th of a second. Well, let's move to 2/50th of a second, and you can see that our box got smaller to represent half as much time that the shutter was open. And look what happened with the aperture. When we moved from f8, the camera moved from f8 to f5.6. It got a larger opening to let more volume of light come in because we cut the amount of time in half. And as we go to 1/500th of a second, we're cutting the amount of time in half, but the camera is corresponding by opening the aperture up more. So just to do that again in quick succession, watching the box representing shutter speed at the bottom and the aperture opening on the right hand side, watch how they correspond with each other. As one gets smaller, the other gets larger. As time gets shorter, the opening of the aperture gets larger. On the aperture side of things, if we're doing some photography and we're starting out at f8, maybe the camera says, okay, you picked f8 for the aperture. I'm going to balance that by selecting 1/125th of a second. And here we have our 1/125th of a second and our aperture opening of f8. And we're going to switch that to a smaller aperture. Maybe we're going for trying to get a larger depth of field. We moved 1 stop from f8 to f11, and the camera had to correspond by moving from 1/125th of a second to 1/60th. At f8, the aperture is this open, and we're closing that down so the shutter has to stay open longer by twice as long an amount of time. And if we go to f16, the camera has to go to 1/30th of a second. It has to be open longer because the aperture is smaller. And at f22, we're at the smallest opening of the aperture, and the camera is selecting 1/15th of a second to accommodate the amount of contact time that light will have with the sensor, to try to balance that and keep a perfectly exposed image. Well, we don't always start out at 1/25th of a second in f8. We can start anywhere out on the scale. For example, we might be at 1/60th of a second, and the camera might select f22 as the appropriate balance. And if we switch to 1/125th of a second, then the camera can adjust to 1/16th. The point is that no matter where we start out, this line is going to go straight across between the scale, just a way to visualize how the camera is making adjustments as we change either shutter speed or aperture. The camera is balancing it with the other feature. Now let's throw ISO into the mix. Let's say, for example, that we're doing some portrait photography and we're starting out at 1/60th of a second, which everybody should be able to handhold, and the and f5.6. So we've selected f5.6 for a shallow depth of field, and the camera has selected 1/60th of a second. Well, notice in the picture that her fingers and the candle are slightly out of focus. They're not quite in that depth of field, and I want to increase the depth of field, so I want to go from f5.6 to f8 to make that depth of field a little bit larger. Well, the camera has to balance that by keeping the shutter open longer. The aperture opening got smaller from 5.6 to 8, so the camera had to keep the shutter open longer from 1/60th to 1/30th of a second. The problem is I can't hold the camera steady at 1/30th of a second, and most people can't hold still for 1/30th of a second to be able to have a sharp image. So what do we do about that? I want this f.8 to be able to have that depth of field to keep her fingers clear as well. What we can do is we can increase the ISO. We move the ISO from ISO 200 to ISO 400, and the camera can then adjust from 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second, and you see that her fingers and the candle are now in that same depth of field as her face. So by making a change in ISO, by doubling the ISO, that has the same effect of telling the camera that there's twice as much light to work with. And because we do that, even though we're staying at f8, the camera was able to balance by going to 1/60th of a second to keep that perfect exposure. It makes maybe a little bit more sense, it's a little easier to understand when we talk about being in shutter priority. We're at a football game and take a picture, and it was starting out at 1/25th of a second, which is not fast enough to keep this player in motion, and you can see how blurry the image is. Well, what I want to do is I want to go to 1/500th of a second. In this case, that is 2 stops faster. So we're going to cut in half the amount of time that the shutter stays open, and then cut that in half again and get to 1/500th of a second. The problem is when we move to 500th of a second, I don't have a big enough lens to accommodate allowing enough light in to have this nice bright exposure. Well, again, what we can do is we can change the ISO. So let's say that we're at ISO 200, and at 1/25th, the camera has picked the largest possible opening my lens has to offer. If I want to shoot at 1/500th of a second, that's 2 stops faster. That means I'm decreasing the amount of light 2 stops. So I need to increase something 2 stops. I can't increase aperture 2 stops, but what I can do is I can increase the ISO sensitivity 2 stops by going from 400 to 800. Now I have more light to work with, and I can keep the aperture at f4, or the camera will keep the aperture at f4, and now that I've increased 2 stops of light, I can take a shutter speed 2 stops faster, and the result is this image. Nice and crisp. So that's another way of looking at the exposure balancing act. I sure encourage you to watch this video as often as you need to allow yourselves to have a mastery of exposure and how the camera balances when using shutter priority or aperture priority.